The day is the 14th of April. The Lancastrians and the Yorkist armies form up for a decisive battle in the War of the Roses. The battle that would secure the throne of England is about to begin. The Wars of the Roses were a series of conflicts between various English lords and nobles in support of two different royal families descended from Edward III. Edward IV, the leader of the Yorkists, seized the throne from the Lancastrian king, Henry VI, and imprisoned him in the Tower of London. Henry's son, Edward of Westminster, fled to Scotland along with Henry's wife, Margaret of Anjou, and organized a resistance. Edward IV crushed the uprisings and pressured the Scottish government to force Margaret out, and the House of Lancaster went into exile in France. As the Yorkists tightened their hold over England, Edward rewarded his supporters, including his chief advisor, Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick, elevating them to higher titles and awarding them land, confiscated from their defeated foes. However, the Earl of Warwick grew to disapprove of the king's rule, and their relationship became strained. Warwick had planned for Edward to marry a French princess and sister-in-law to King Louis XI of France, in order to create an alliance between the two countries. Edward IV secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, who was regarded by the Yorkists as an unsuitable queen. Warwick felt marginalized. His influence over the young king was failing, and he decided to take drastic action to force Edward's compliance. He planned to replace the king with his fellow conspirator, the king's younger brother, the Duke of Clarence. Warwick instigated several rebellions, which led to the Battle of Edgcote on the 26th of July, 1469. The battle resulted in a victory for Warwick rebels, which caused many of Edward's men to desert him, and this allowed Warwick to successfully capture King Edward, and he brought him to Warwick Castle. However, most Yorkist supporters refused to rally to Warwick's call, and the Earl was pressured to release the king. Warwick continued the rebellion, and this led to the Battle of Edgcote Field. Warwick's men were crushed by King Edward, forcing him and the Duke of Clarence to flee to France. In a deal brokered by the French king, Louis XI, the Earl agreed to continue supporting the Lancastrian cause. Warwick returned to England with an army of 20,000 men. The force was made up of knights, billmen and archers wielding longbows. They also had cannons among their ranks. Lancastrian commanders included John Neville, 1st Marquis of Montague, Henry Holland, 3rd Duke of Exeter, and John de Vere, 13th Earl of Oxford. This massive force caught King Edward off guard, and he temporarily fled to France but soon returned and began gathering his own army. Gathering more men as they went, the Yorkists moved inland towards York. Once Edward's force had gathered sufficient strength, he headed south towards London. His army now consisted of some 10,000 men. The constitution of the army was similar to the Lancastrian army, with knights, archers, billmen, and cannons being present. The king himself was a decisive and experienced commander. His personal leadership was key in rallying his forces and maintaining morale. Edward was also joined by his brothers, Richard Plantagenet, Duke of Gloucester, and George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence, who had abandoned Warwick and accepted his brother's offer of pardon. Lord William Hastings, who was a loyal subject since the start of the wars, was also present. Facing the disadvantage of being outnumbered, Edward hurried to meet the Lancastrians with a surprise attack. Edward reached Barnet in darkness, and without knowing the precise location of his foes, prepared the battle line. Under a strict order of silence, the Yorkist army crept closer to the Lancastrians. During the night, neither commander spotted the opposing army, an event that proved crucial in the battle the next day. During the night, Warwick ordered his cannons to continually bombard the estimated position of the Yorkists' encampment. The Yorkists, however, had sneaked in close, and the Lancastrian artillery overshot their enemies. In the morning, the two armies formed up. On the Yorkist side, King Edward deployed Hastings on the left and Gloucester on the right flank. Clarence would fight alongside Edward in the centre. A contingent of reserves was kept at the rear, ready to deploy at Edward's call. On the Lancastrian side, the Earl of Oxford commanded the right flank, Montague the centre, and Exeter the left. Warwick held his position in the reserve. Montague approached Warwick and advised him of the troops' low morale. He suggested that, as the highest-ranking commanders, the brothers should fight on foot throughout the battle instead of riding on horse. The soldiers believed that mounted commanders tended to abandon them when the situation deteriorated. By staying on foot, they would show that they were prepared to fight to the death with the men. Oxford, on the Lancastrian right, was the first to make a move and attacked the Yorkist left under Hastings. Oxford's group quickly overwhelmed the Yorkist left, sending Yorkist soldiers fleeing towards Barnet. Oxford's group disintegrated as they split off to loot the fallen enemies. Yelling and chasing after his men, Oxford struggled to get his men back together. In the centre, Edward's men clashed with Montague's men and Gloucester clashed with Exeter. In the centre, the fighting was evenly matched and intense. Due to the fog, visibility was low, and the two main forces failed to notice Oxford's victory over Hastings. The Lancastrian left wing under Exeter was being beaten back by Gloucester, similarly to how Oxford had done on the right. Warwick, seeing the shift, ordered most of his reserves to help ease the pressure on Exeter. and took the rest into fighting at the centre. By this point, Oxford had gathered his men and headed back to the Lancastrian centre, where Montague and his men were. His group arrived unexpectedly at Montague's rear. Obscured by the fog, Montague's men assumed their allies were Edward's reserves and unleashed a volley of arrows. Oxford and his men immediately cried treachery and began withdrawing from the battle. Their shouts of treason were spread quickly throughout the Lancastrian line. Men started fleeing in anger, panic, and confusion. Edward saw the Lancastrian centre in disarray and sent in his reserves. On the Lancastrian left, the Duke of Exeter was killed. A cheer arose from the Yorkist soldiers, and amidst the confusion, Montague was also killed. Witnessing his brother's death, Warwick knew the battle was lost. He made for the horses in an attempt to retreat. Edward recognized his victory was at hand and, deciding that Warwick was more valuable alive than dead, sent the order and dispatched his guards to bring back the Earl alive. In the retreat, Warwick was killed as he fled from the battle. By this point, the Lancastrian army was in full retreat. By the end of the retreat, the Yorkists had lost 1,000 men, and the Lancastrians 8,000. Henry VI was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he died, likely murdered, shortly after. The Battle of Barnet was a devastating blow to the Lancastrian cause. Warwick's death removed one of the most influential and capable leaders of the Lancastrian faction, and the loss at Barnet paved the way for Edward IV to solidify his hold on the throne.